Welcome to Vinyl Junkies. This episode of Digging the Bins is going to be about jazz funk. It's been a while, hasn't it? Sorry, been occupied with other things, also Vinyl Junkies related, but today we talk music because it's way more fun. So today we'll talk about jazz funk, and since it's such a huge topic and covers such a large period of time, well, not large, but a decade for sure. I figured what we'll do is just boil it down to a couple of artists. So those artists will be Miles Davis and Donald Byrd and Herbie Hancock. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm just waiting for my wife to say, yeah, man, everything's okay. So yeah, what we'll do is that the Donald Byrd's a pretty easy place to start. Our sponsors, Vinyl Me Please, have 2 Donald Byrd records out this month. So I figured it's a no-brainer, to throw it in, and I'm pretty sure that everybody wants to hear about Miles Davis. So those of you interested in ordering some Donald Byrd, there's Fancy Free that's out as one of their subscriptions, and a double LP. You'll see my copy is messed up because I haven't gotten mine yet, but double LP stepping into tomorrow. Both Blue Note series records, so those Blue Note fetishists are going to be able to fill in their collection a little bit. I know it's never as good as an original Blue Note, but that's another argument altogether. So, jazz funk. What happened there? I can tell you that it's music that really turned off the people in jazz circles. And I guess so, because it's not what they were expecting. So let me try to throw a couple of things into perspective and see if we can get this. Let me just check my wife's message real quick, okay? I'm pretty sure she's going to say, everything sounds great, or you don't see me, or something like that. The camera's not on? I don't know. Is the camera on? The camera must be on. Sorry, folks. I'll be with you in just a second. It looks like it's working, but I just want to make sure. Okay, so mitigating factors to creating this kind of music that combines this jazz music that, of late you look at people like the Marsalis brothers and Stanley Crouch and a bunch of people that are, have been putting a long time considered effort into kind of just having it considered in the same canon as classical music, which of course it should be. I mean, it's highly complex and wonderful music, but at one point it stopped going that way and started going pop. Is that the right thing? So I think that there were a couple of mitigating factors that brought that into the picture. One of the things that comes into the picture, of course, is the civil rights movement, and I think you guys know I love this period of music, so I'll talk about stuff like the civil rights movement quite a bit because it'll just keep coming up in music. It's really way too hot in here to be wearing a toque. I thought it wouldn't be. Then the festivals began, and that came into the picture as well. Flower power. So we had a political shift happening with just culture and society. Women becoming more empowered, black folk fighting for their place, and the music took on that shift as well. I don't know. Jazz started off as kind of like a folk music almost, something that black folk would do in order to keep themselves busy, and then became into its own language. It developed into its own language. But once this big cauldron of civil unrest or civil change started coming into the picture, it seeped into even something like jazz. This is how I mean. I think that if you take a look at music just in general, I guess black music, I, since that's mostly what it is that I like from that period, but if you take a look at that period of music, you'll notice that everything kind of turns into itself a little bit. What I mean by that is identity becomes a very important thing, and rather than splinter off into a bunch of different types of music, it's almost like all music became focused on the expression of blackness. And that expression of blackness showed up in various ways. It manifested itself politically, so some bands, became political. And what happened with music was, if you took the various types of quote-unquote black music, they started just all to meld together. So all of a sudden, there wasn't such a big difference. There wasn't this gap that was happening between jazz and funk. There are other, and R&B, for example, or Motown and so forth. As a matter of fact, you would very often start seeing jazz bands start adopting that kind of music. There's other factors that came into, I think, why this stuff came to be. And I would most certainly point to festival culture. So that's probably why we have Mr. Hendrix out in the background. But Woodstock brought an entire avalanche of other festivals. And those festivals introduced music to a whole bunch of new people that didn't know it before. So once upon a time, when you were looking at jazz, people like Miles Davis could sell 10,000 records, 20,000 records, and Columbia was happy with that because those were boffo numbers when it comes to jazz. Every once in a while there'd be records that obviously broke through. I think of something like Dave Brubeck's Take 5, for example, that just really did break through. And John Coltrane, My Favorite Things, which was actually even released as a single. But for the most part, there were small numbers and it was club stuff. If you went out to Europe, then jazz was recognized a lot more as a higher art and was given that type of respect. So, the shows might be a little bit bigger. There was something there that made the musicians very amenable to going down to Europe and playing their concerts down there because they felt like they were being treated like artists and people, whereas, they'd hop the plane and all of a sudden feel like, they were being celebrated out in France and then come back here and you can't get a hotel. You have to use separate bathrooms. Demeaning. So the politics really invigorated that music. And we saw it everywhere. Somebody like Jimi Hendrix comes into the picture, and the festival, all those festivals, Isle of Wight, some of them aren't coming to mind right now. Obviously, Woodstock is the one that comes to mind. What's the other really big one? Somebody help me out over here. I don't remember anymore. What's that other big one that Hendrix played? The Star Spangled Banner. Why don't I remember this stuff? Sorry, man, memory, just brain fart. But you know what I'm talking about, right? So what winds up happening there is all of a sudden you got hundreds of thousands of people listening to this music and hearing it for the very first time. That's going to sell a lot of records, and that's exactly what happened. Suddenly, jazz, artists like Miles Davis, who we will get to, start dating Betty Davis, and she introduces him to Hendrix, and as he's checking all of this out, he realizes, hey, a lot of white people are buying these records, and these are huge crowds. There's something here, besides the fact that this sound is really rad. And of course, Miles was a very, strong-headed, strong pro-black man. Not political, but just a very, very strong-minded individual. Began seeing this and started putting two and two together and started seeing things like Sly and the Family Stone, who became really the very first huge integrated band to hit the charts. They were huge. So this changed music a little bit. This changed jazz a little bit as well, because now the sound changed, the audience changed as well. Once upon a time, I mean, now we're going way back, but once upon a time, blues records is what I'm talking about mostly, but, black records were called race records because there was a market for black music and there was a market for white music. Now, obviously, I'm going way back there, but what I'm saying is that eventually those two worlds came together. As time went on, this music obviously developed and there was a little bit of a crossover, but it's only once this mass of music reached a crowd that was intermingled that all of it changed. So even when radio came in, radio was segregated. There were the black stations and there were the white stations, and you didn't mix the music. Okay? Now you're talking a festival, and it's a completely different thing. So you got Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young playing at the same time as Sly and the Family Stone, playing at the same time as Santana, and so forth. So suddenly you have hundreds of thousands of people that are listening to this music and catching it. Think about you guys when you go to festivals or when you catch a band. It's like, wow, I didn't know this existed, but this is really fucking hot. So people even like Ravi Shankar, man, were there. Some of the very first Moog shows, the first Moog, the Moog, took place at these festivals because that's where it is that they thought they'd be able to sell these instruments to the musicians, so they'd feature them at festivals like, again, they're not coming to me, not Woodstock, but the stuff that came after that, after they began getting a little bit more organized. But this changed the sound and it changed the audience. The audiences started getting cross-pollinated, so it wasn't a jazz audience anymore that was just listening to jazz. People like Miles Davis come into the picture and fucking change everything. So he comes out of Kind of Blue and, scores this massive popularity with it. And that first great quintet that obviously launched him to as big a star as you could possibly imagine in jazz, he just decides he's going to take all of that and say fuck it, because he wants to play with young guys. So he puts a bunch of young guys together like Ron Carter, let's say, on bass, and Tony Williams on the drums, and a young Herbie Hancock on the piano. And this revitalized the music. This made the music go in a completely different way. I realize that I'm kind of meandering a little bit because the story does go all over the place, and we'll get to Donald Byrd eventually too, but it's because of all of this meandering that this music started mutating, but started mutating for black people around a common theme, even as it found a different audience. Okay, so there's the political item, and that made jazz and all black music just kind of come together and say, you know what, this isn't blues, or this isn't jazz, this isn't whatever, gospel, this is black music. So black people and black artists started identifying as that and started playing black music rather than really going off in these other directions. And people like, so again, Sly and the Family Stone and Jimi Hendrix made a lot of these artists realize, hey, there's some good money here. These young cats, these young kids are going to buy these records. So maybe there's something there. So as this was happening, just this entire kind of melting pot, music changed. And all of a sudden stuff, that came from big band and Dixieland and bebop and post-bop and just that whole jazz thing melded into something a lot more popular that turned all the jazz critics off, and that is jazz funk. So I won't have time to go into a lot of it, but I'll go into at least a little bit of it. Maybe we'll go the artists. Talked about Jimi Hendrix, right? Okay. Yeah. I'm sure that I'm not the only guy who watched the Quincy Jones biography on Netflix. I was so happy to see that. I'm a long time fan of Quincy Jones, but It was fun to see the spotlight shed on him, and this was one thing that actually was a big deal, just to kind of tell you what the sea change was a little bit. But this album over here, They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, is the very first soundtrack. It represents the very first film soundtrack scored by a black man. And the reason this happened, as you know, for anybody who watched the Netflix, is because folks like Frank Sinatra just would not have anything to do with racism. He was not a bigot. He was raised, his mom was a liberal, and she was a local politician in Hoboken, where he was born. So he was very much raised in around strong people, firstly, and to believe in tolerance and acceptance of everybody. So when he grabbed Quincy Jones, he basically put Quincy Jones on the map by just taking him on tour with him and having him score and really placing a lot of praise and of the spotlight on him because he felt he deserved it. And that launched Quincy Jones into a completely different stratosphere, where now he was being considered for things that he would have never been considered for. And this is something that happened across the board, okay? All of a sudden you have people around the same time, again, you have the Malcolm X. I know I'm like throwing in a bunch of things, but I guess I'm just trying to paint a little bit of a picture. Sidney Poitier was the very first black actor to get a leading role in a film, all around the same time. So They Call Me Mr. Tibbs here is an example of Quincy Jones' very first soundtrack. And it happens to be the first soundtrack ever composed for a major film by a black man. So we see that there's a whole lot of things that are changing. Some artists did become more politicized. So jazz funk wasn't really that, but I figured I'd go into it a little bit to just add some context. So in terms of the types of things that would kind of be thrown into the pot, as I flip records, I'll try to make the entire story happen. Some of the more political stuff, in terms of, let's say, if we had to go the other way around and you had to take R&B, soul, that type of thing, and give it a message, and try to mobilize a community of people. You'd have an example of Melvin Van Peebles, who had a major recording contract, but didn't really record music. He was basically just doing pro-black projects. This particular case here, this is something from the 70s. It's largely, I think it's 71 actually, largely considered to be the very first quote-unquote blaxploitation soundtrack. Features members of a band called Brer Soul that would go on to form a band called the Pharaohs, and then would go on to form a band called Earth, Wind, and Fire. So Maurice White basically began his career there. And on the one hand, there was that happening. On the other hand, just again, to go into an idea of how pervasive this culture was, the way it was that everything just started getting mixed together. Gil Evans, from obviously his brilliant work that he did with Miles Davis, Sketches of Spain, Porgy and Bess. Check this, man. Even Gil Evans decided to grab his orchestra and play the music of Jimi Hendrix. And this is a brilliant record. This is really something you should get. But, all this is to say that this melting pot was happening everywhere. We look at some of the traditional jazz artists, and here's where we get a little bit more to the point where we'll get to our three artists. We're boiling down. Traditional artists, even like Cannonball Adderley, went on to embrace the same type of thing. We'll see the same type of thing also with, Pharoah Sanders and Alice Coltrane. Okay, I think I've made my point. Nina Simone and so forth. Now, if we boil down to our first, the three artists that we're going to talk about today, there's Miles Davis, there's Donald Byrd, and there's Herbie Hancock. Let's see if I can bring all of that together. Should we go with Miles Davis first, or should we go? You know what? Let me go with Donald Byrd. You guys doing okay? Have a nice weekend. We are going to tell a story for Donald Byrd, and let's see how that goes, all right? In terms of the music of Donald Byrd, he really did wind up kind of he was one of the fathers, or one of the godfathers of jazz funk, or widely considered one of the godfathers of jazz funk, and one of the guys whose art was poo-pooed by the jazz establishment. Yeah, I can't put these together because I can't find my copy of Fancy Free somehow. But what it is that made him go a little bit towards this music, because those who know Donald Byrd, I mean, he was a trumpeter who played with all the greats. He helped invent the voice of bebop, you know, and he had a long established career in jazz music. So this language is something that he knew very, very well. But Donald Byrd was an inquisitive guy, so he used to teach at universities, and he'd be asked to work at universities, so he was always in touch with young people, and this influenced his music. And if you follow his career right down to working with Guru on Jazz Mataz, he said right up to his death, pretty much, it's all music, you know, and we bring it together. So he already had that idea, and where this music hadn't really found its language yet, the seeds were already sown, because there he was, a professor at a university with a bunch of music students, all younger students, and this infuses a certain energy, and these are the types of people that grew up with black power around them, and grew up with people like Jesse Jackson and the entire movement. So this obviously came into the picture, and Donald Byrd was very much a chameleon when it came to this, or maybe not so much a chameleon, but he's somebody who absorbed these types of things and then went out and made him his own. So this energy made it so that the music started changing. Before that, you'd start hearing basically traditional jazz forms, but with young folk, all of a sudden the electric organ starts getting involved, and that's where it is that we start seeing the beginning. Fancy Free. Okay, so if you listen to it, the difference between Fancy Free and what comes before it is there's a little bit of that organ sound. So we start getting a bit of that funk happening, and so it goes. He would continue messing around with that throughout his Blue Note career, and released some records which I would very much like to suggest to you. So here, this is going later, but into the 70s, Street Lady, just to kind of get into the culture, you can very much see what the imagery is, you know, the idea of a sweet soul sister, and the music speaks exactly to that. You know, there's that whole aesthetic of pimps and prostitutes also, and the music catches that. So suddenly this music is something that the young kids can listen to, and a lot of jazz was marketed towards young kids very, very specifically. So you'll see jazz labels all of a sudden selling more records than they ever did to a different demographic. And this is the kind of music that resulted. You'll notice that a lot of these Donald Byrd records, this is all Blue Note stuff, but these Donald Byrd records just didn't sound like the early Blue Notes. It was another thing. Okay, this one is the one that's coming out by VMP, Stepping Into Tomorrow. Can't suggest it enough. Mine's a 70s copy. VMP put out a double LP copy, 180 gram, the whole bit, you know. So looking forward to getting that one. And so much so that what you'll notice when it comes to this is that a lot of the bands splinter and become entities of their own. So the one that I'm thinking of in terms of Donald Byrd is his students, even after he kind of like schooled them and stewarded them, into music and incorporated them into his own band, Fancy Free being, the example of that. Um, those students went off and basically created their own band at the direction of Donald Byrd, but it was their own thing. That was the Blackbirds. And if you have a chance to pick up some Blackbirds records, I could not possibly suggest it enough. As a matter of fact, there's one track called Walking in Rhythm on, is it the first Blackbirds record? We're looking at 74. That actually became a hit. I believe it became even a top 40 hit. So that was a pretty cool thing, and suddenly, in terms of for myself, that's where I really started getting into jazz. Because now, jazz wasn't this complex language. It wasn't this complex language that I had to learn. It wasn't like the equivalent of classical music for me. Classical music is something I'm still trying to wrap my head around because it's a different language. So there was a bit of that disconnect, curiosity, but disconnect. Now with the infusion of funk and R&B and musicians playing together, what winds up happening, and the fusion of styles, what winds up happening is the music becomes, I guess, much more palatable to exactly what it is that they were trying to get to. Younger white guys. So it spoke to me. And I can tell you, man, during the 90s, during that entire acid jazz thing, and, as jazz, hip-hop, that fusion began coming up during the 90s, and I'm thinking of bands like Digable Planets and Tribe Called Quest and De La Soul, and boy, oh boy, did companies like CTI and Blue Note just hammer their catalog. Hammer it! They put out a whole bunch of, I don't know if you guys did the same thing, but they put out Blue Note, I'm thinking about. There was this series of CDs called the Blue Groove series. And it was bands specifically like Tribe and De La that got me to go there, and later Farside and so forth. But they would price these things low. I believe around here they were like $7.99 or something. So you can get a whole fuck ton of them. And it was brilliant. I mean, it was just one of the ways that the record industry basically recycled their catalog, and they're doing it again now, of course, by putting out the catalog, but just introducing this music in a format that people were seeking out. And for me, that's really what got me on my way to my love for this music. CDs, not vinyl. So, I guess that's where Donald Byrd comes in. And of course, you can know that, Donald Byrd, in terms of where it is that he became a little bit more of a household name in hip-hop was, man, would I be wrong to say that it's not Gangstar, but Guru, Jazzmatazz? I always loved Guru because not only would he play with all of these jazz musicians, but he actively shouted out a lot of them. So guys like me who just wanted to further their music knowledge would listen to this music, and I didn't know it at the time, so I wasn't able to pick up the samples, but Guru laid it down in an easy way because he'd shout out the artists, and at that point, guys like me would go out and it's like, oh, Donald Byrd, who's Donald Byrd? Who's Herbie Hancock? And went out and bought the records, and there we go, So Herbie Hancock, how does he come into this picture? Because he becomes a funk monster, right? And I mean, the guy's still going strong. Last year, was it? He toured with Kamasi Washington, as a matter of fact, on a double bill. That must have been amazing. I didn't have a chance to see it. I went and watched, I forgot who I went and watched. It was another, Yob. Yeah. They were playing on the same day as Yob, so I wound up going and watch Yob instead of Kamasi and Herbie Hancock. But just to say that the guy's still a monster now, and as a matter of fact, if I'm not wrong, if memory serves me, they're going to be naming a university after him. But they're taking the name away from another jazz artist. I wish I would have remembered. It's just one of those things that popped into my head, But Herbie Hancock was always at the vanguard of new music. And even in the 80s, and even when we didn't understand it, do you guys remember Rocket? Just a bunch of kind of mannequin legs moving around all weird, and this electronic synthesizer music that made no sense. And of course, now we look back and we see it for the genius that he is. It is. But his music would long influence hip hop, and is hip hop as far as I'm concerned. But Flip a Cantaloupe, Flip Fantasia. You guys remember that? Us Three. I don't have the record. I used to have the CD. I'm sure many of you guys did. But for the sake of the story, I guess I started it there. Herbie Hancock with Empyrean Isles, right? Just to kind of give you an idea how the music kind of fuses into itself. Cantaloupe Island off of this is pretty much just a jazz piece, And then you take people like Us Three who turn it on its head and make something different with it, acid jazz. But I guess where it is that if we had to look here, we start getting into Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock's worlds kind of joining together, and they do go off in different directions. But for the most part, a lot of their music is fused together because Herbie Hancock was part of the second big quintet that Miles helmed, and it was the launch of fusion. It was the launch of funk. It was the launch of so many things that changed music forever and pissed off the establishment. That tiny little establishment that was called the jazz world, didn't like it. But Miles surrounded himself with a bunch of young cats, and they would play this music, and somebody like Herbie Hancock would play the piano, and obviously he was, very well trained and did play, traditional jazz piano, if you want to call it traditional, but he would also play around with other types of keyboards as well, so organ, keyboards, Moog. He'd play with all of them eventually. And somebody like Miles, an environment like Miles, was very much kind of like a cauldron. Okay, Miles fed off of this energy. The thing with him is that he was like a voodoo machine. He just knew how to just extract this young energy and somehow guide it into something else. And he managed to do that with all of his musicians, including Herbie Hancock. Now, I guess what we'll do is we'll go there first, since we're talking about Miles Davis. In terms of Miles, where does the sound start becoming funky? I would say if we go back, Miles in the Sky is probably where the sound starts getting a little bit funky. And here, it's the introduction of the organ that really changes everything. So we do have, the electric piano, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter on the sax, Tom Carter, Tony Williams, all the big cats, most of the second great quintet. And what they're doing is, rather than just playing with traditional jazz sounds, they're toying around with different sounds. Herbie Hancock is trying his hand at this electric music, and of course we know where that would go. Just a little bit further, we get into the beastliness that is Bitches Brew. Now, by this point, Miles was very, very deep into his culture, practicing boxing, so you'll see a very young, spry Miles Davis. And because he was surrounded by youth all the time, from his wife, Betty Davis, to the music, to his musicians, he was constantly experimenting. And the experiments took him in places that were not traditionally jazz. So all the old guys wanted him to keep playing My Funny Valentine and ballads, where he was interested in taking the music elsewhere. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that most Hendrix files and most Miles Davis people know that there was discussion of Miles and Jimi Hendrix working together, and that never came to be because, of course, Hendrix died. They never even rehearsed. As far as I know, the conversation only went as far as they were nailing down the last dates for when they'd meet and rehearse, and then Hendrix died, right? But something like Bitches Brew launched fusion. There's the funk in there, but now he's got these guitarists doing crazy stuff like John McLaughlin. And the music, again, is going in a bunch of different directions, and you'll notice that
people like Santana are doing a lot of the same thing also. So he's, rather than writing the vibe of jazz music, which, in effect had died almost at that time, or a lot of it had. If you remember, around 64 or something, Duke Ellington had pretty much died. It's only after he played Newport that his career was revitalized. But, a lot of these musicians were looking for gigs. A lot of these musicians were looking for that thing, and they saw that there was a place to make this music. So people like Lou Donaldson all of a sudden just started getting funky, and a genre was born. Miles would go off into a bunch of different directions and really created a catalog which is just, it will never be repeated again. From something like Miles in the Sky, where he starts off really with the jazz funk, to Jack Johnson, his tribute to the boxer Jack Johnson, which I always describe as his Jimi Hendrix record. That was the game changer. But that was more along the rock and roll. And he was absolutely looking to sell records to the rock and roll crowd. So Bitches Brew and Jack Johnson, his records, he wanted to sell a bunch of them. And he did, of course, right? I mean, Bitches Brew, I think, on one of those top 50 lists or something like that, somehow, or top 50 or is it top 500, wound up even in the rock canon. It's like it sold rock and roll numbers. Where did it sell? 500,000 records back then? It was unheard of in jazz circles. So it changed. And then, so much so that he made a record that completely put the jazz world behind him. It wasn't even jazz anymore, and he just straight up made it clear, this is funk. This is who it is that I'm trying to attract with this music, and that is On the Corner here. The art, I think, speaks for itself, and the music very much is unlike, it's not a jazz record, it just isn't, and it wound up totally pissing off the audience, of course. So we start seeing, that's the Miles story. In terms of Herbie, of course, is still younger. He's Miles's junior, but as he's growing under the tutelage of Miles, he's also, it was kind of almost like a John Coltrane thing, not quite as meteoric as John Coltrane, and it's a different style of music. But what I mean by that is that he had his side thing. He always had his side thing. So he worked, but he always had an independence about him, and composed his own tracks. So from using Miles Davis as his launching pad, he went into adding to this jazz funk canon. And if I had to follow his catalog a little bit, I would say that a lot of where Herbie Hancock music starts getting really funky is right here. Fat Albert Rotunda. Fat Albert Rotunda marks the time that, is this the first one, or is it Wandishi? But he joined Warner Brothers for 3 albums, did Herbie Hancock, and this was one of them. And here you start seeing that it's not funk anymore. It becomes its own thing. And if you're looking for early funky Herbie Hancock, this is probably a good place to start. Fat Albert Rotunda. The trio of albums on Warner Brothers would be this one, an album called Mwandishi, and an album called Crossings. So if you get those, you're getting the funk trio from the Warner catalog, and a really pretty essential catalog. It'll definitely be part of the Spotify playlist. And then, of course, Herbie Hancock had his own album, his own, I call it Bitches Brew, his own Bitches Brew, in the sense that the album that kind of launched his career into another stratosphere, and that was most certainly the monster that was Headhunters. And by this point, Herbie put the piano away for a little bit. He was still doing session work on stuff like the CTI records. But the thing is, even CTI had a very soulful vibe to it. Okay? It wasn't your father's jazz. So even traditional instruments were being used in a different type of way. But Headhunters just took it completely to another level, and believe it or not, as much as this is the big one, the albums that followed were even heavier. Thrust is a killer. Thrust is a killer. What's that third one? The name's not coming to me anymore. But, yeah. So that, folks, clocking in at 40 minutes, is my spiel on jazz funk. I would say that 65 to 75 is really the time when you should be spending, where you should be digging a lot deeper. When you're looking at the Blue Note catalog, a lot of the Blue Note catalog tends to veer more towards the organ jazz. Okay, where it is that you start getting like funky is you start seeing a little bit more in the CTI catalog. Warner got pretty funky as well. And Miles, of course, Miles on Columbia just took it in a completely different direction. So any record between 68 to 75, right up to when he retired, is another world there. That's an episode all on its own. And that, folks, is where it is that I'm going to end for today. Thanks for watching. Next week, by the way, is Thanksgiving weekend. What it also means out in the States is that Record Store Day is happening. Black Friday, the biannual celebration of independent record stores. So we're going to do our part. I know that there's some records coming in, and we're going to do a live show with Billy of Warner Brothers. So tune in for that. More jazz shows, a bunch of other things, including a best of 2018. So December's coming. It's time for us to start thinking about what our favorite records of 2018 were. I can't wait to see your lists, and we'll do a little bit of comparison shopping, if you will. But yeah, stay tuned for the middle of the week for our RSD show, and thanks for tuning in. Later, guys.